There are people who are so angry now because the American dream for them is dead. They can't graduate high school, get married, have 3 kids, live in a 5-bedroom house, drive 3 cars. It's not possible anymore. Western countries are going down. They're going down in economic freedom rankings. They're going down in personal freedom rankings. You're going to see more taxation. You're going to see more surveillance. You're going to see more restrictions of freedoms, including on citizens who go overseas. They use the dollar as a weapon. And so what I think happens with de-dollarization is the less, dollar hegemony they have, the more they're going to be backed into a corner. The governments get heavy-handed. We've seen Western countries come in and confiscate people's assets, including the United States in some cases, including people who are perfectly innocent, just got swept up in something. So I want to have bank accounts in other countries that might have access to money in case someone pushes the wrong button. I don't know what's going to happen, but something bad is going to happen.
Hello, I'm Michelle Makori. Thank you for joining us. Go where you're treated best. That's the founding policy of my next guest. Andrew Henderson is the founder of Nomad Capitalist, helping entrepreneurs and investors reduce their taxes and live a more global lifestyle. Andrew has spent more than a decade visiting and living in over 100 countries in search of freedom and opportunity and perfecting offshore strategies. His goal is to help people live a life of true freedom where they can choose how they spend their money, pay less in taxes, diversify their risks, and safeguard their assets by planting flags worldwide, meaning finding different countries that offer the best benefits for different aspects of life. Andrew is also the author of Nomad Capitalist and the executive producer of the Nomad Capitalist events. Andrew, welcome to Kitco.
It's good to be with you.
Excited to have you with us, Andrew, and to get your insights. And given you have access to so many successful people around the world and you have a global perspective, want to get your thoughts on a number of topics, including the top global risks or concerns, the role of gold and Bitcoin in asset protection, asset diversification strategies, where in the world the most secure banks are, which countries are safest from CBDCs, and what's the best passport in the world to hold. So we have a lot to discuss, as well as, of course, the upcoming Nomad Capitalist event, which I'm super excited about. But given that this is the first time you're with us, let's get you introduced to the Kitco audience. And let's start off with the founding principle. Go where you're treated best. What is the driving philosophy of the Nomad Capitalist?
Well, the driving philosophy is most people settle that the place they're born is the place that they get a job, they go to school, they raise their kids, they get married, they keep their bank accounts, they keep everything. Everything is in that one basket. And what we've been seeing in my lifetime, certainly over the last 30 plus years, is Western countries are going down. They're going down in economic freedom rankings. They're going down in personal freedom rankings. You mentioned the best passports. We put out the Nomad Passport Index every year. 8th year in a row. It's U.S. passport's the 44th best in the world. That's actual quantitative data of ranking passports. And so I was told by my father when I was very young that the trajectory in the U.S. was going in the wrong direction. That doesn't mean it's going to become a third world country, although there's certainly elements of it that have become that way with corruption and with some of the cost of living and so many issues. But it means it's going to be a lot worse. It's not going to be the best country. There's a lot more competition. And in a world with a lot of competition, somehow countries are the only thing we don't shop for. So go where you're treated best. Those are the 5 magic words. My father told me when I was 12 years old, and I've applied it now as an adult to say, why do I pay 43% tax to live in a country that doesn't give me a lot? Why do I have a passport that's the 44th best and accept that's my only option when they're increasingly heavy-handed? Why do I accept anything from one country? I want to pick the best places, not the ones that feel emotionally good to me.
So, Andrew, you share many of the same libertarian ideals and beliefs of decentralization and less government overreach that many of our viewers and our guests share, which is why there's a big synergy here and why I'll be emceeing the Nomad Capitalist event in Malaysia in September this year. And there'll be lots of Kitco fan favorites at the event this year. George Gammon, Danielle DiMartino Booth, Mark Moss, for example. You've previously had a number of other Kitco fan favorites, Jim Rogers, Peter Schiff, Robert Kiyosaki. And we'll get more into this later in the show. But briefly, what is the agenda behind Nomad Capitalist Live in Kuala Lumpur this year?
Well, it's a 4-day event. It's almost like a concert. We don't have sponsors. We don't have anybody paying. You're not going to go outside the ballroom and have somebody shoving an order form in your face. You buy a ticket and we serve you. So a couple of folks that you mentioned have been there before. We do have a couple of folks that are coming again. We have AirAsia CEO Tony Fernandez. Took 26 cents, turned it into billions, one of the largest airlines in Asia. How do you learn how to generate wealth in other countries? Malaysia is one of my second homes. I love it there. There's opportunity. He's going to talk about that. Emerging markets, lower taxes, everything that a nomad capitalist needs to know, we're going to talk about. Second passports. We've got a team that I think is second to none in the world. I think a lot of the competitors think it's second to none. And we're going to be talking from their perspective. How do we hire around the world? How do we build and manage our corporate strategy? We've got companies all over the world. How do we do that? It is a hassle. How do you save yourself the hassle that we've had to learn the hard way? So it's a lot of real world experience for 4 days. It's fun. There's some emotion behind it. The theme this year is love. You think, hey, I'm here to lower my taxes. What about love? I think a lot of people right now, especially in the West, don't feel very loved. They don't feel very heard. They don't feel very respected. We're going to tell you where you can go to solve not just the lower taxes, not just more freedom, that when the next Black Swan event happens, you're not stuck, not just the latest opportunities for what's the cool new market where people are making money from the actual experts, but where do you go to feel comfortable? Because I talked to a lot of folks in the US that are at each other's throats. I'm out of that. And I'm proud to be out of that. And I want to show people that. That's why the event's not in Las Vegas. I want people to see the alternative. It's in Kuala Lumpur because it's a place that I love. It's tax friendly, and I hope people join us.
All right. Well, I hope they do too. I'm excited to be joining and also learning more about where to feel loved and appreciated on the world stage. Again, we'll get more on the event later on in the show. But let's focus on one of the main principles of the Nomad Capitalist, and that is having multiple passports and multiple citizenships, hence the nomad. Why do you advocate for that? What are the advantages there?
Well, I grew up in the United States, and what was interesting is I grew up very, very close to the border of Canada. Had some event happened, I could have been born across the lake, and I would have been Canadian. Maybe none of this would have happened. But Americans have this unique problem where you're taxed no matter where you live. Now, I was an entrepreneur, and so I was able to dramatically reduce and most years eliminate my tax, but I was restricted in how I used the money. If you're an investor, you don't have that many options of where you can move as an American. And so the first step is, I think more countries in the West are going to put in some kind of system that makes you their perpetual slave, even if you want to leave. And so you want to be able to say, you know what? I don't agree with this. I'm out. Because I'm a big believer in following the law. If I don't agree with the law, I go where the law agrees with me. And I think every country gets to make their own laws, and we can pick and choose what works for us. So I gave up my US passport, and I won't say taxes were really the main driving issue, but I've got a lot less paperwork to do in my life. I have a lot more free time. I have a lot less stress. That's a nice bonus. So I think being able to, leave your current nationality is not the worst thing to have. I think that you look at the pandemic. We had Americans. I was selling a house to an American. It took him a year to get a passport. I was getting my passport renewed in 1 day. So that's because I have citizenships that they actually serve the population of their country. They're not big enough to be able to have the impact that the U.S. does and to not care about you. I just think you're going to see more taxation. You're going to see more surveillance. You're going to see more restrictions of freedoms, including on citizens who go overseas. I have American friends doing business in Asia. They're held to an American standard for how they do business in Asia. That may not be how Asia works, but they're American, so they're held to it. Or else they can be thrown in prison for not following that. For following the way business is done in Asia, they can be thrown in prison. And so I just think from a freedom perspective, from a financial perspective, and as Jim Rogers told us last year on stage, he can't invest in a lot of places. Certain crypto investments aren't available because you're American. So big brother in a big way. If you have other passports, you have the freedom to do that. And I also think as the U.S. continues to alienate a number of countries, I don't want to travel around as an American. I've had a much easier time getting residence permits as a non-American. I think that if you have a passport that brings some drama with it, you're going to have fewer opportunities. And lastly, look at this TikTok thing. It was under Trump. Now it's under Biden. Which countries are going to say, you know what? The U.S. stiffed us. We're going to stiff them back. I do business all over the world. We have clients from all over the world. What if Brazil said, hey, we don't like your passport? you can't sell to our people anymore. That would be a problem. So having multiple passports gives you the ability to avoid all those things, travel to more countries, have more opportunities, whether it's opening bank accounts, buying different funds. But for Americans, the big question is, do you want to be American?
Well, what would you say that it's contrary to a patriotic spirit, that you should want to be American and bring those values that made America back to America?
Listen, if you're in a relationship and the person starts punching you in the face, are you going to say, well, I'm loyal, I promised I would stay in the relationship? Or are you going to say, listen, I'm being punched in the face, I need to get out of here? I'm a big believer in equal exchange of value. And that's the premise that citizenship has been sold to people on. I think the pandemic woke a lot of people up, where Australians, for example, couldn't go back to their own country. Or we had clients that got exemptions to leave and they're told, don't come back. That's not the basis of citizenship. Even the United Nations, hardly a libertarian organization, that's been their thing for decades. If you're a citizen, you can leave and you can come back. And they've just totally thrown that out the window. So I think this whole construct of citizenship is something that you get, and it's a privilege, and you're part of us. You're one of us. You're part of the tribe. Look at Canada. They did a survey. There was a substantial minority of people who said Canadians who choose to leave and live overseas should be taxed in Canada because they've had the privilege to grow up in Canada and live there. I thought it was I thought it was a part of you. I thought we were all part of the same group, Canadians. No. When people's backs are against the wall and they need to raise revenue and they need to stick the bill on someone, you've paid enough. If you're a successful person, you paid more than everybody else. But emotionally speaking, the population in countries in the West, which wages are going down in real terms, people are getting angrier and angrier, people are at each other's throats. They're going to try and impose more things on you. So it's not a two-way pact. And quite frankly, I'm grateful to my parents. I'm grateful to certain teachers that I grew up with. I sent one of them a copy of my book. I'm grateful to people. I'm not grateful to a country. What did the country do for me? The country set up something. I paid them a lot of money over the years, and eventually I said, this is no longer for me. Like, I'm no longer going to a restaurant that stopped providing a good service. But for some reason, this is the one thing where we're supposed to be patriotic. Good marketing tool. If I were a country and I wanted to make people pay whatever amount of taxes I want and follow any rules I wanted to, might be a pretty good marketing tool to say that you're not patriotic if you choose to opt out of that system.
All right, I get your point. I get that the system is no longer working for you, as it's no longer working for many people, given that a lot of those values that some of these countries are supposed to uphold and represent are eroding as we speak. Now, it's important to note, though, that everything you do is by the book. You're working within the system. It's all legally within the system. So how many citizenships can one person hold at once legally? What's the maximum amount? And I get that it differs on which countries those are, but what's the maximum amount?
Yeah, I mean, you've got Singapore, the Netherlands, it's pretty strict on you can only have one. You've got countries that are not that strict on you can only have one. They've got a few countries where it's you can have dual, or maybe you can have three. But by and large, if you're American, Canadian, Australian, British, Irish, and most countries these days, really dual citizenship this century has become the norm. You can have as many as you want. I had, I think, 3 additional ones when I was American, and I've gotten 2 more since. I've dropped the Americans. So, I mean, we had a guy who called and said, I want Plan J. Get me as many passports. We actually sat down and mapped out for, I think, about like $4 million in donations and like $8 million in investments and some fees. On top of that, the guy could get like 14 different pretty unique passports from the European Union to smaller countries you might not think of. And that's allowed as long as your country allows dual citizenship, which the United States does, Canada does, most countries increasingly do.
You mentioned, by the way, that the American passport is 44th in the list in terms of most desirable passports. By what criteria is that? And I guess it brings the question, what is passport number 1?
Yeah, so I mean, they're mostly European passports. You saw Switzerland and Ireland and Luxembourg, they're generally right up there. The criteria is 50% visa-free travel, and then the rest being perception, taxation, and personal freedom. And so, the U.S. reputation, I think, in the eyes of a number of countries is going down. Now, I understand if you go to the UK, you're going to be treated relatively well. But I think that the problem is that people like Americans, they say, oh, there's nowhere to go. Why would I bother with all this? Well, there's nowhere to go because you went to the UK. I just flew through Heathrow. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. Even in Ireland, it's a bit more laid back, let alone Malaysia. Go to Malaysia and see how different going through the airport feels. Go just see how any procedure feels. And so there's that daily experience. There's the reputation. Who hates the Malaysians? Who hates the Irish, right? And so you can go to more places. I'm a big believer. When the fur starts flying, you're not going to want to go to the UK. And I think, again, COVID proved this, right? Where were some of the most free places? We had people going to Mexico. Well, I mean, what could happen with the U.S. reputation with Mexico? Is it going to ever go away? No, but I think Mexico is standing up for itself more now. The peso's done well. They're doing better with their resources. They're pushing back on some of the U.S. interference. I think that I've seen experiences where having a U.S. passport is harder to get certain residence permits, as I said. So reputation matters. I'd like to be from a country where no one's got a problem with me, whether I want to do business there, whether there's no geopolitical problem. That's the kind of passport that I want. And so I think that lowered the U.S. score. Obviously, EU passports, you've got multiple countries you can live in. So if you're an Irish citizen and you decide, hey, this place is going to the birds, I'm moving to Bulgaria. Low taxes, maybe they leave me alone to a greater extent. You have all those different countries in Europe that you can move to. And the other benefit of a European passport is you can live in any country in Europe. So if you're Irish and you decide, hey, this place isn't for me anymore, I want lower taxes somewhere else. I want to go to Bulgaria. I want to go to Switzerland. I want to go to Italy, which has a deal. You can do that. You just move on in, kind of like changing states. So, and now you're seeing the Caribbean passports, they're getting together the Caribbean community. You could live in 14 or 15 different countries, some of which are very tax friendly. So, some of these passports offer you more than one country to live in, which I think is also a great benefit.
Now, certainly having options and choice is a huge benefit. And as you mentioned, when you're faced with a global crisis, as we saw during COVID, you want to have that flexibility. And your company guides people in developing a passport portfolio, in obtaining citizenship through investment, allowing people to relocate to other countries to lower their taxes, to keep more of their wealth, and for various other reasons. So where are the majority of your clients originally from?
People are from all over. We've historically had a lot of folks from the United States and from Canada and from Australia and from the United Kingdom and from Germany. But I'll tell you, we're reaching more and more people all around the world. We have people from Brazil. We have people from Vietnam. We have people from Egypt. What's fascinating to me, and what I would say to push back on people in the West who say, this isn't fair, this is still the best place to be, tell me how the guy in Vietnam made $100 million building a company from scratch. He grew up in a village. Tell me how the guy in Egypt, who grew up, again, in a small town, has a $5 million income from building an online business. How is that the case when all the opportunities are in the West? You're seeing more democratization of wealth, and therefore, as we've expanded our business, we see people from all over the place. But a lot of Westerners, certainly, because I think they resonate with the message that I understand, which is things have been going in the wrong direction. Again, I've been following that for my entire life since I was a teenager, but they're picking up on it now.
So what would you say is the profile of the majority of your clients then, in terms of net worth, in terms of where they're coming from?
It starts with, people with $1 million or $2 million net worth all the way up to multi-billionaires who, maybe want to work with us just for one piece of their puzzle at the high end. Other people, with the, $1 million, $10 million want an entire holistic plan. And so you're seeing more and more families. What we saw 8 or 10 years ago was a lot of e-commerce entrepreneurs, people making money online, crypto traders very early on. They believed in what we're talking about. They wanted a legal solution. Now, I think since the pandemic, you're seeing more families that are saying, you know what, let's get everybody a passport. Let's get everybody a couple passports. Hey, can I add on my 25-year-old son? Is it too late for him? I want the family protected. They're doing more buying of real estate in other countries. Maybe that gets them a residence permit or a citizenship. Maybe it's just a lifestyle purchase, but there's a lot of countries, if you buy property, you can get a residence permit and you can also get a bank account and you can diversify in a couple different ways. In the case of a place like Turkey, you can even get citizenship right at the bat by buying property. And they're saying, listen, we want to have diverse places to go. I think that's the big thing that people are being convinced of is we're not trying to go to the same place. Maybe if we're from the US, we're going to live in Ireland. They have a good tax deal for foreigners. It's English speaking. We can get a passport in 5 years. But, if things really go crazy, sure, Ireland's probably better. They stay out of the military alliances. Small country. Nobody dislikes them really. But I need a place in Asia. I need a place in South America. We're seeing a lot of people who want to go to South America just to have a toehold there. Give me a residence permit. Maybe I'll buy a small property. Maybe I'll buy some land, people are increasingly saying, so that I have places I can go to. So if you're an American, you're looking at land in somewhere in Central or South America that you think if the worst comes to worst, you're chartering a jet and you're flying down to your home with your residence permit, where in a black swan event, I went to Colombia where I've got a residence permit during the pandemic. It was easier for me to get in than any tourist who wasn't already set up. So that's what they're thinking.
So, Andrew, you mentioned this worst comes to worst, and I'm curious what that scenario could be, because you've spoken extensively about the end of the American dream, how social cohesion in the US is arguably worse than ever before. So from the people that are looking to relocate from the US or get a second citizenship or have more passports in their portfolio, as you put it, what is the top concern for Americans right now?
I think it's a matter of levers. I don't think there's any one top concern. I think people are taking it in the totality of what it is. I look at 3 buckets: finance, freedom, and lifestyle. And if you have 100 marbles, how many go in each? For me, leaving the US as a young person, I think lifestyle is more of an issue, but taxes also bothered me. I did feel somewhat unfree in the US, but I think it's gotten worse since then. So I think some people's lever on freedom is very high. We had multimillionaires who wanted to move to Mexico and Nicaragua back during COVID because that was where they felt the most free to avoid what they didn't want to do. We have people who are much more focused on taxes. But I think if you look at them in the totality, the fact that people, Biden wants to raise your taxes, and there's more people than ever coming out and saying, cry me a river, crocodile tears, oh, the poor rich people, that's a cultural shift. And so that's not just about taxes. That's about where's the country going. 25 years ago, if someone said, let's have a maximum wage, let's have a wealth tax, they were on the fringe. They are no longer on the fringe. And so you can say, hey, I don't really worry about reducing my taxes. Do you worry about being around people, some of whom are increasingly saying, let's go back to the pre-Kennedy era. Let's go back to 90%. I heard it in the UK. Let's go back to when it was in the 80s and 90s. There are people who are so angry now because the American dream for them is dead. They can't graduate high school, get married, have 3 kids, live in a 5-bedroom house, drive 3 cars. It's not possible anymore because people like me are hiring people in Georgia and Malaysia and Colombia. And so there's more competition. And their governments have done a bad job. So I think that that's what people are afraid of. And they're afraid of, look at what happened during any of these black swan events. I mean, the average person goes along with the government. You can be a libertarian and act arrogant that everyone agrees with you, but it's not the case. So they're afraid of all of that.
Right. And as you say, it's the momentum, it's the trend that seems to be moving in the wrong direction. And part of that trend, as we start to see lack of faith in America, in the American dream, in American military might, is this trend of de-dollarization, which I'm assuming you have firsthand experience with. I mean, we know countries like the BRICS are opting to trade in their own currencies, moving away from the dollar. Countries are holding less dollar-backed reserved assets. According to the latest IMF data, the US dollar accounted for 59% of global allocated foreign reserves in the third quarter of 2023. That's quite a significant drop from several years ago. So what are your thoughts on the dollar being dethroned as king of reserve currencies, having this global perspective that you do?
Well, I think one of your guests said it'll happen in his lifetime, and he's a little bit older than I am. I think dethrone sounds very violent. I think things happen in the margins, and every year you see a percent here, a percent there. I think it was in the low to mid 70s at the turn of the century. So now you're down to 59. I think at one point it was even a little bit lower than that. That's what happens at the margins. I mean, marginal changes drive big results. And what does that lead to? The U.S. uses that dollar reserve position to do a lot of things. Number one, to go and bully countries to impose sanctions. You saw in the Russia-Ukraine war, they wanted to look at secondary sanctions. If you buy Russian oil, if you do whatever else, you're going to get sanctioned. They realized it would backfire. Well, that had backfired 25 years ago. So I see that the kind of countries we're talking about. Now, I'm not saying that we're talking about Russia or China or some of these, countries that are in the oil business, but the kind of up and coming economies that I look at that I invest in some cases that I have the ability to live in, I think they're emboldened. And they realize that the US government has used this strong dollar to sanction almost 4 times as many countries and people as the turn of the century. I don't think there's 4 times as many bad guys. I think a country got drunk on power, got used to no competition. You think they're going to treat you, the citizen, any better than they treat everybody else around the world? They use the dollar as a weapon. And so what I think happens with de-dollarization is the less, dollar hegemony they have, the more they're going to be backed into a corner, the more they're going to have to come out and look to raise taxes, look to bring in money on things like crypto with taxes there, or people who aren't paying their taxes on crypto. They have to go after those people. They're going to go out and probably start some more conflicts. They're going to probably start more trade wars. They're going to increasingly get debt. They're the tiger backed into the corner. That's what I see de-dollarization. I think it's going to gradually happen over time. I think we talked about how maybe it gets down to somewhere in the 30s in the next 2 decades or so. That's kind of like the has-been business you went to back in the 80s or 90s, and they still exist, but it's like no one ever thinks about them. Whatever that business is where you are, you're kind of getting into that territory. And it's easy to sit in the United States and say, hey, this seems like the center of the world to us. Go to Asia, go to Singapore, ask the bankers in Singapore, as I did, where would you rather the money come from? They say, we have plenty of Indonesian clients. We have plenty of Indian clients. We have plenty of people from here in Singapore. We have plenty of Thai and Vietnamese. We don't want American money. We don't need it. We're conservative. We're some of the strongest banks in the world. The U.S. is hardly the center of the world to us. And I think that's the way the world is going. That's the consequence.
Well, if you're seeing the move away from the dollar as a gradual development, not something happening suddenly, and not necessarily bringing in other assets into the conversation like gold and Bitcoin, we'll get to that later. But from your experience, which fiat currency is gaining popularity, if there is one, or if there's a group of existing fiat currencies that seem to be more appealing in this new era?
Well, listen, I know that any fiat currency is super appealing. I like to be diversified. I think there's opportunities in that. Look at the Mexican peso. I was on CBS News not long ago talking about the peso's amazing rise. That speaks to what's changing in Mexico. If I were to give birth, or if I were with someone who gave birth to a child today, I would rather give birth physically in Mexico and have a Mexican citizen child, because I'm not an American, than I would to have, give birth in the United States and have an American child. I think that Mexico, with all of its problems, will be trending in the right direction more than the United States in the next 18 years. So the peso's done well. Look at some of the countries that we've talked about. The Georgian lari, the Armenian dram have benefited from migration due to the war. Those currencies have done incredibly well in the last 2 years. And if you look at stocks like Bank of Georgia, TBC, those look like incredible bargains on the stock market. I'm not giving anyone a tip. But if you look at PE ratios, if you look at dividend yields, if you look at all the performance of those banks, it outperforms any Western bank. So you're seeing in some of those emerging market countries, they've benefited from some of this stuff. Mexico is benefiting from some of the issues in China and a push to nearshoring. So those are some of the better ones. I like the Singapore dollar as a developed currency. I think that it's a very well-run country and currency. So, those are 4 that I would look at.
All right. Well, one of the tips that you give is on asset protection via geographic diversification. So not only diversifying the types of assets that you have, but where you should have them. Break that down for us.
I believe in having assets around the world. I have homes in 7 different places around the world. That's a form of lifestyle diversification. I can go and live there. I can see what's happening for my business. I can enjoy being in different cultures. I can pull the lever that if something bad is happening in one place and there's a lockdown or there's a problem or whatever, I can go somewhere else. I don't have to live in one place full time, which helps with tax planning. So I can, reduce my taxes if I need to. I also have places that are tax friendly. That I wanted to go there to live full time, I could. But, that real estate helps me in many cases get residence permits or citizenships, which means I have more personal freedom. I'm more than a tourist when I go there. If something bad happens, they're generally going to let me in. I have a higher level status. Maybe I can invest in local markets once I get that citizenship where a foreigner can't. But it's a form of asset protection. People set up these offshore trusts and they put their U.S. real estate in it. Well, if you're going to get in trouble in the United States, the judge, and I've seen this happen, they're just going to say, hey, great, the real estate's here. We'll take that. Thank you very much. We don't care what some guy in the Isle of Man or the Cook Islands says. And obviously, I suggest people follow all the laws. But, the governments get heavy-handed. We've seen Western countries come in and confiscate people's assets, including the United States in some cases, including people who are perfectly innocent, just got swept up in something. So I want to have bank accounts in other countries that might have access to money in case someone pushes the wrong button. It happened to me before. I paid my taxes. They limited my account. I had to fight them for months to get the money I already had paid them and have proof of paying them back. They don't care. Didn't bother them. I was without my money. And so I think, you want to look at not just having a holding company offshore or a trust offshore. You want to make sure you have a property you can live in with passports to go there, or residence permits, bank accounts. If you hold gold, consider putting some either in your house overseas or in a safe deposit box or in a foreign vault overseas. And if you have Bitcoin or crypto, maybe you put a physical ledger in a box somewhere overseas. I want to have assets where they're fully diversified, not just the structure is diversified.
All right, well, let's talk about the structure, though, because you mentioned gold and Bitcoin. Let's start off with gold, because we talked about the demise of the dollar, the demise of fiat currencies at large, and we have central banks buying gold at record levels, gold just hitting a new all-time high. Another record high this week with June futures rising above 2,300 an ounce, up around 11.7% year to date. Gold is seen traditionally as a safe haven. What are your views on gold as a safe haven, as a store of value, as an asset for the nomad capitalist, for the global citizen?
It's part of my portfolio. I'm not all in on anything. I mean, one of my big philosophies is you want to take a couple percentage points of your net worth and you want to buy some insurance the way you would for your house burning down or your car crashing or whatever. Insurance for me is residence permits, citizenships, asset protection structures like trusts. I mean, that's what makes sure the rest of the stuff is kept safe. I think people don't realize that until it's too late. Entrepreneurs don't realize it until they get too big and they start having problems. Every business does. Investors, everybody else thinks, it'll never happen to me, and then it does. You want to take some of the money off the table to do that. I think gold's a nice part of the equation. You can borrow against it in some of these places offshore, as I suppose you could in the U.S. I don't borrow, but I let it sit there. So it doesn't yield anything. It's done very well in the last couple of months, and it's done very well, since I bought it. But to me, that's protection. It's something that's not, digitized. And I let it sit there in a private vault in places around the world that I believe are safe, so that I'm fully diversified. And whenever I want to go and grab it, I can. And in some cases, I have. So that's my philosophy on it. I'm not all in on gold. I'm not all in on Bitcoin. I think you want to be extremely diversified because there's any number of risks that each different asset class hedges against.
All right, well, let's talk about Bitcoin, because that is seen as the asset that appeals to many global citizens, given that it's seen as digital gold. It has many of the same factors Bitcoiners would argue, except that it also has the ease of transportability. Bitcoin also hitting a record high earlier of over $73,000, up over 56% year to date. So good performance there. Yeah. I know you have some big Bitcoin experts at the upcoming event. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin then?
I'm bullish on Bitcoin. I like it. I like the premise. I think that we want to avoid getting too much stuck in our own press. The wider adoption gets in Bitcoin, the more average people are going to get into it. I remember my father and I were on the internet many, many years ago, the nascent days of the internet. And he said, listen, one day it's not going to be nearly as libertarian because the average person's going to get on and they're not libertarian. And he was correct. So you have this very libertarian Bitcoin. I got my first one for about $800 in 2014. I stupidly sold it. I got back in probably around $4,200 in 2017 and a bunch more thereafter. The more adoption you have, the more people are going to want it to work like a bank. The more people are going to want regulations. The average person wants to be regulated. What we're talking about does not apply in the average country. The culture has changed. Maybe the places that we talk about where people just say, hey, let them own their Bitcoin. But in Western countries, I think there's going to be a risk. And so I don't believe that, a senator in Wyoming is going to single-handedly stand up to the system and make sure that Bitcoin is ushered into the United States. I would have concerns being a U.S. citizen owning crypto assets because you've been locked out of certain markets. We've had people who've wanted to get second passports just to get more opportunities in those markets. I think there's going to be increasing regulation, not outright bans, but regulation. You're seeing that in the European Union. And I think they're going to go after it in tax. If you're not paying tax on your Bitcoin or your crypto when you're selling it, I think you're crazy and they're going to come for you. But overall, I'm bullish on it. I just think people should be concerned. It's not going to be some libertarian panacea forever.
So it's interesting that you're raising a point that many Bitcoin purists or Bitcoin maxis have, and that is with this widespread adoption and with it becoming part of the traditional financial system, with the likes of BlackRock launching their spot Bitcoin ETFs, with it becoming an institutional asset, it takes away from its decentralized and libertarian ethos, which is a point of concern for many Bitcoiners. But in terms of how your clients see it, is it now an established asset? Is there still concern about government overreach, over regulation? Because you recently made a video discussing second passports to protect your Bitcoin. So what do you see coming there? Do you see regulation or excess taxation as a big risk to Bitcoin?
When I gave up my U.S. citizenship, I had a number of personal reasons that not everybody has. Obviously, not having to fill out so many forms is a nice thing, but it wasn't a key driver. What I said was, the mood is changing. I've wanted to renounce for some time. I feel that some of the conversations now are, I don't know what's going to happen, but something bad is going to happen. Now, I was proven right during the pandemic when people literally couldn't renounce, and there were people who owned Bitcoin and it was going through the roof, and they're subject to an exit tax that they may not have had to been subject to had they been able to renounce promptly. So I just said, I think some bad things are going to happen. I think we're moving in the wrong direction. And I don't want to necessarily prognosticate about what that is. Again, it comes down to culture and it comes down to intent. I'm a citizen of, among other countries, St. Lucia. Obviously, if I go and live in St. Lucia, I'm going to follow the laws of St. Lucia. They actually do have personal income tax there. I could live in other countries nearby that with that passport that don't have income tax. But I don't think they're going to chase me around the world and tell me how to hold my Bitcoin. As long as I do things legally and ethically where I live, they're going to leave me alone. And I'm happy to do things legally and ethically. But, the U.S. to me, in countries like that, could be China as well, could be Australia, could be anything like that. They're going to want to be more heavy-handed. And I don't know what it's going to be. I don't think it's an outright ban. But you're seeing the EU, restrictions on privacy and that kind of thing. Who knows what it could be? All I know is, including under Trump, laws came in where, hey, you know what? Let's go back a few decades and let's rewrite the rules. You can play by those rules now. That's scary when they can go back decades and say, hey, listen, we were just kind of joking. Can you, do what we didn't say? They'll do that again.
Right. I mean, people forget that there was a time in U.S. history when gold was banned, right? Yeah. So it's not beyond the realms of comprehension that those kind of regulation changes happen. And just because something is a certain way now, it doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. Andrew, we saw a lot of interest in Bitcoin, particularly after the bank crisis in March of last year. We had 3 of the largest U.S. bank collapses in history. And you've recently highlighted that American banks are still very much at risk, especially for those that have more than the FDIC insured amount. You looked at other banks globally as being safer. So give us a sense of how risky you think the U.S. banking sector is at the moment, because I believe you said that the top banks in the U.S. are actually 60th in terms of safety on the global stage. Break that down for us.
Yeah, so they put an index together of the safest banks in the world. It used to be the 50 safest banks, and really no U.S. bank would show up. Now it's 100 safest banks, and you're starting to see a couple of them. But you compare JP Morgan Chase, the stock has done pretty well in the last year, but you compare that to the big 3 banks in Singapore, it's a head and shoulders difference. Conservative, you go to Hong Kong, for example, whether you like Hong Kong or not. I mean, for years, it's been, we don't really want more money if we don't know who you are, if you're not referred to us, if you don't really live here full time. We're conservative, like we don't want money. How many banks are falling over in Hong Kong? How many banks are falling over in Singapore? A lot of banks fail in the U.S. It's the most failed bank country in the world by far. That's partially because there are a lot more banks. But I mean, look at the second, third, and fourth biggest bank failures in the world in the U.S. History last year. If you hold large balances, you're basically at the whim of Congress stepping in. And again, I go back to the earlier point of who's going to bail out the rich fat cats anymore when the average person doesn't have $500 for a car repair. And that's been the case for a long time, but I think it's getting worse now. Who's going to want to, let Congress go in and say, yeah, you know what, let's put some money and override the FDIC if they can't find somebody to take over this bank. And what if it heats up? I mean, things were not as bad as they were expected to be by many people last year, and you still had these bank failures. So you're basically at the mercy of Congress stepping in. Now, if you're in the UAE during the Great Recession, you were at the mercy of the government stepping in, but they said, listen, we're going to insure every dollar, every dirham, everything, no matter what happens in our banks, because we have stricter standards for what it takes to be a bank. You're going to be publicly traded. There's all sorts of things. So I just think that other countries, I'm not a huge fan of UAE banks. The service is that great. The interface isn't that great, but like Singapore, for example, far superior in terms of, in my opinion, safety for large depositors. The problem is if you're an American, maybe they'll open an account for you, but it's increasingly tough because they don't need Americans.
You've highlighted Singapore as having the safest banks. What's the criteria for safety?
Well, the criteria is some of the banks are more conservative. I mean, the DBS Bank, I believe, was lending money to the central bank. I mean, they're just better run banks. They keep, stronger balance sheets. And, the US, I think it's just much more aggressive. Listen, maybe that contributes to some positive things if you're a shareholder, but if you're a depositor, listen, look at the index, right? I mean, people say, I'm going to keep my money in the safest place. Well, number 60 is not number 1.
So Development Bank of Singapore, DBS, one of the safest banks in your estimation. Now, I get the concern that if you have more than the FDIC is ensuring, you want to spread around that money. For people that are able to diversify, where they keep some of their deposits spread around a number of banks globally, how much of that is actually legal, though? What are the implications of that? And I get that it differs depending on where you're from in the world and the jurisdictions there. But for the purpose of our audience, we'll keep it to Americans and some Canadians. So what is the strategy then of the Nomad Capitalist when it comes to diversified banking?
The strategy is your average accountant who does domestic work is not going to understand what you're doing. They're probably going to talk you out of it, and they're not going to understand which forms to file. And I've seen people who come to me who they had accountants, they were living overseas, for example, they were told they had to file forms. There are one or two relatively simple forms. If you have a trust structure, maybe there's an extra form. If you've got a foreign corporation, there's an extra form or two. But there's not that many forms. They're not that difficult to fill out. If you have an international focused, tax professional, they'll handle it for you. In fact, when I did my taxes as an expat, when I was an American, those forms were just part of the deal, basically. It wasn't an extra cost. And so I don't think that should be an impediment if you're doing the other stuff. If you're doing enough to be able to justify having some kind of international accountant, it didn't cost me much more to have that, but you don't want to go down to your domestic preparer down the street. There's a couple of forms to file. You report the high balance. You report, movements between the accounts. And there's a few things to be aware of that some countries, some banks might have 3 accounts in one bank, and you want to be aware of all those different account numbers. But yeah, I at one point had something like 40 banks. I just went through recently and closed about 8 of them because they were too duplicative. And I realized they weren't serving me, but I've tested out a lot of banks. I like having diversification. I like having, assets in different places. And if it's in the country of Georgia, you can open an account with like $1. I'm going to keep a smaller amount there. Maybe I'll take advantage on the short-term basis of the very, very high interest rates there. And I'll keep much larger amounts in Singapore. I think European banks are probably pretty difficult to deal with. In many cases, there are some exceptions, but I think people should be looking at emerging markets or hubs like Singapore.
I've got sirens blaring in the background, Andrew, as though they're signaling that they think that the U.S. banking sector could be in a major sense of distress. As though they're figuratively
I'm afraid for your
echoing.
safety, Michelle.
As though they're figuratively echoing your sentiments there. Look, speaking of banks, Andrew, one of the speakers at this year's event in Kuala Lumpur is Nigel Farage. And he'll be talking about how to avoid bank accounts being cancelled with cancel culture and the future of the West. Now, Nigel Farage, of course, former British politician and broadcaster, very well known for his strong advocacy of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, or Brexit, as he will. He was the leader of the UK Independence Party and later the Brexit Party. And there was a lot of controversy when Nigel Farage's bank account was closed, when he was essentially debanked from a prestigious private bank owned by the NatWest Group. And he was essentially taken out of the system, which is a big concern. And you could argue that was because of his political position. Explain how much of this is a growing issue, that cancel culture, political opinions, people not agreeing with your sentiments or ideologies gets you canceled out of the system, and what we can do about it.
Well, Nigel spoke at our event in 2022 in Mexico. And what he told me when I met him recently was, he said, I came to this thing, this is a good plan B. He said, I'm increasingly think it's a plan A. And what's funny is not long before he spoke at that event, we ran into him in Montenegro, where I have a summer home, and he's looking for opportunities. And I told him when this happened, I said, I understand, politically exposed person, former politically exposed person, that's an issue. But for the average person, if you have an opinion they don't like in the UK, like you're for Brexit and the banks don't like that, do you think they care in Montenegro? They probably have the opposite opinion. They're probably happy with you. They probably love you, right? It's a different opinion. So that's what I tell people. There's different opinions everywhere. And I think that, people think, oh, that sounds odd. Different countries see things differently. You can have America first in the US. Montenegro wants to have a Montenegro first. And that means if they have different views, they're going to promote those. Now, they're not extremely different. It's not Iran. But I told him he should be looking at places like that. What he told me was there are a lot of people in the UK that have had this problem that don't have a voice. And it is an issue. I've had accounts in the US closed. I don't think because of who I am. I think it's because of where I travel. I think it's because of US banks. When you use their credit card in Colombia, they freak out and they have this stereotype. I remember at one point, JP Morgan Chase cards, my parents would come to Malaysia. You can't use your card in Malaysia. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but they said it's a fraud country. I've never heard of that in my life. No other card, I have dozens of them, does not work in Malaysia. So there's the insular thinking of the United States banks and how they don't want people to travel. They don't like expats in many cases. But I think a lot of people are having that happen. Nigel says that in the UK, they're looking at legislation to fix that. But, if you're going to live in a free market world, I guess banks can work with who they want. If you're on the wrong side, that's why I want to be diversified. Because whether it's Montenegro or you fill in the blank, any number of other countries, especially smaller countries that aren't big banking hubs, they're not really going to care what you're doing. They want to know that your money's clean. And that you're clean, and they don't care about your perspective because those aren't their problems.
Well, Andrew, this is where the issue of central bank digital currencies come in, because then you will be under supposedly the ultimate form of cancel culture and censorship. And of course, to remind our viewers, central bank digital currency is a form of fiat issued by a country's central bank, allowing the government to monitor every single transaction, thereby eliminating all privacy and anonymity. And the currency can also be programmable, meaning that with a simple click of the button, it can decide what purchases you can or cannot make, what transactions are allowed, who can make those transactions. And so central bank digital currencies are seen as the antithesis to, I guess, the values of the nomad capitalist and libertarians. Yeah. You've studied this because you see that this trend is happening. Over 130 countries, according to the Atlantic Council, in active stages of developing a CBDC. Which countries are safest from a CBDC perspective in terms of least likely to adopt one?
Well, unless they've done something very recently. I was in Serbia over the New Year, and they were pretty clear, I think, on not doing this. I think that's a country where they lift up the middle finger to a lot of this kind of stuff. I think people there are pretty educated, which is one thing you can't say in the West. I mean, if you meet someone who's 25 years old in some of these Eastern European countries, they're a lot more educated, a lot more knowledgeable about history. They speak more languages. They understand what's happening in the world much more than someone in the United States. I've got a friend in Ireland. He said, I'm dating a 45-year-old woman. All we ever talk about is her favorite TikToks of the day. I said, this is the perfect sign of the decline of the West, where you have people who are 25 years old in Georgia listening to Tchaikovsky, and they can tell you the entire geopolitical, situation. What happens when you have Western populations and they don't know what's going on? I mean, that is a problem. And so I think, Serbia is one country that's done a good job at that. I think there's always going to be some countries. I mean, part of the reason that I'm advocating is kind of maybe a plan D or E of having some kind of African passport is I think there's going to be countries there that don't do it. And you're seeing an emerging middle class in Africa. Not everywhere, but there's places where you can go and you can live. So, I think Eastern Europe's been a decent bulwark against some of these anti-freedom policies. But I'll just say this. I've been thinking for 15 or 20 years, this stuff would happen, not with CBDCs, but they would track, through even your credit card. Oh, you go to the pub too often. You know what? We're rationing healthcare now because we ran out of money. So, you know what? if you have cirrhosis of the liver, that's not our problem. I think that the government always is going to ration the freebies they gave away because the freebies can never be covered. And you've even seen Republican politicians in the U.S. saying that they always want to raise the cap on Social Security, or the age limit rather. Now they're saying, if you're Warren Buffett or Mark Zuckerberg, you don't need Social Security. Well, you paid into it. Maybe you should get it. So they keep changing the definitions. And that happened well before CBDCs.
Yeah, changing the rules as we go along. Are CBDCs inevitable, though? Do you think, if you said you saw the trend coming in a different format, are they inevitable? Is it inevitable that we will have some kind of digitally controlled and monitored currency, potentially linked to some kind of social credit system where the government can monitor your behavior and adjust your financial allocation of freedom accordingly?
I say this, I don't know if it's inevitable or not. I say this, go to Montenegro and talk to the woman who pays the bills for my home and for my land. And she goes in on a Tuesday at 2 p.m. and people are smoking around a card table, playing cards. Maybe they're sipping a glass of scotch. That's how it works. I don't think that those kinds of people who are running that country of 600,000 people have the impetus, the desire, or the inclination to do the same kinds of things that they talked about with Bitcoin in the UK or the EU or the US. I don't think it's the same level of nefariousness. And so even if it was inevitable, I would think that, what you'd see with countries that were independent, which have their own fiat currencies, which went on this, on their own. If you give me a choice between a US CBDC and the Bahamas CBDC, listen, maybe the Bahamas is too close to the US, I'll take the Bahamas. And so, listen, if it's an inevitability, I guess it's an inevitability. And if that's the case, you're not going to stop it. I'm not going to stop it. The viewers aren't going to stop it. I'd rather give myself a fighting chance. I'd rather be diversified. I think one place to go is places where cash is widely accepted. There's places I go, they don't take credit cards. They're still in cash. There's places I go, people take cash out of the bank or they put cash into the bank. You can't do that in Western countries anymore. They don't allow it. Cash is anathema to them. And so I think that's at least a good start. I think that, when in a country, we had the former president of Georgia speak a couple of years ago, and he said, when we took a hatchet to all the institutions and we kicked the IMF out, you would meet people in a cafe and their mother got laid off or they had some problem thanks to what you did. They would come up and tell you about it. That's a lot different than in Washington, where they're in this walled city, or in Australia or South Africa or even Canada, these cities that aren't even, the capital city isn't really a significant city, where you're isolated. In a lot of these countries, when you do stuff in a small country, you hear about it and you've got to actually deal with your citizens. That's why I get my passport renewed in 1 day, not 1 year. They've got to actually deal with their citizens, and they're not busy going out, starting feuds with people and, pissing people off. They're actually serving their citizens. I'm not saying that, it's the most efficient service in some of these places, but hey, 1 day to renew your passport's pretty good. I just think, rather than prognosticating what could happen, we have to have some faith that countries operate a little bit differently. And a lot of these people, if they had the ability to, maybe they would take power, but they don't. And therefore, I think the culture is different.
Where are you seeing that cash is still very much king? Which areas, which countries?
Parts of Asia, parts of the Middle East. I was just in South America, more so there. They're doing more of the card stuff. You're seeing a lot of fintechs and ghost kitchens, a lot of the stuff you're seeing in the US because there's that US influence, but it's still acceptable. You go to Western Europe, it's largely not acceptable. But yeah, those are Asia, the Middle East primarily, which is where wealth is going back, where the center of wealth is heading back in that direction, ironically.
So I get the philosophy is, instead of worrying about it or prognosticating as to what will or will not be, just prepare yourself, diversify, make sure you have a plan A, B, C, and D. But before worrying about a CBDC, we may need to worry about a nuclear war, Andrew, because you've highlighted that topic in one of your recent videos. And look, it makes sense. We've got billionaires increasingly investing in these elaborate doomsday bunkers with speculation swirling around their motivations with all of the global uncertainty that we're seeing. You mentioned Mark Zuckerberg. We know that he's reportedly investing, around $270 million in constructing some underground fortress in Hawaii. Peter Thiel, the PayPal founder, he's reportedly working on his own bunker in New Zealand. There's also talk of him sharing it with Sam Altman from OpenAI. So you recently started to look at this concern of nuclear war, given that so many of the world's elite, or not so many, but a fair number, are seemingly taking some action there. How high do you think the chance is that something like this could happen?
It doesn't keep me up at night particularly. It seems a little far-fetched to me, and yet you see headlines from some of Putin's people, hey, it could be likely. Now, they've been saying that in various different ways since the beginning of the war. We've seen, decades ago how it came very close. So I guess number one, I think that to be a successful entrepreneur, just to be a happy person, you have to kind of focus on things you can control. For me, controlling is, where do I spend time? And, I don't want to be in belligerent countries that are targets, whether it's a cyber attack, nuclear war, you name it. I think those are bigger targets. And so I don't worry about it as much because I've taken steps to protect myself. People say, oh, well, if there's a nuclear war, you're not going to have time to go anywhere. Right. You want to be there before anything bad happens. That's what I've done. We help people create plan Bs. They get the passports, the bank accounts, the trusts. They get all it ready. And maybe they'll get on their private jet or a commercial flight when the time comes to go somewhere. But a lot of people want a plan A. As Nigel Farage said, we're getting closer to plan A territory. There's better options for taxes, for freedom, and maybe to protect yourself from some of this stuff. I don't sit around spending a lot of my time thinking about nuclear war, but it's in the news, and you'd be silly not to spend any time thinking about it. And I just frankly think if I had to be stuck in New York City or in Chile, I know where I'd be.
I guess it's not New York City. But in terms of what you reported on, are there particular geographic locations that you think are probably safer in the event of something like this?
Yeah, they talked about Peter Thiel's New Zealand. What he did was great. He went in and basically got citizenship granted to him through what's called an exceptional citizenship procedure. There's other countries that do that. So now he has the ability to go there at an even playing field, to buy land at an even playing field, and to do whatever he wants. That's a little bit harder to get to, but I like that better. I think the poor man's version of that is somewhere in South America. It's just there. It's wide open, mostly in the Southern Hemisphere. You've got a lot of, mountainous terrain in some areas that maybe helps you. Iceland's also been mentioned. That seems kind of right in the middle of some of the problems. But I think kind of the South Pacific and I think South America are interesting places. And also maybe parts of, the Indian Ocean, like a Mauritius or something like that.
Safe to say, me being in the heart of Manhattan is probably the worst place in the world to be.
Probably not a good place to be.
in general, and especially for any kind of black swan event or geopolitical development. How concerned are you, though, about one of those hitting this year? Because we've had a lot of guests come on the show saying that 2024 is the time for the perfect storm, considering that there's so many unvariables, so much uncertainty, particularly if we look at the United States and the election coming up and the political divisiveness that brings and the sense of chaos that is sort of rampant in the US at large, as you just mentioned. Now, granted, the US isn't the center or everything in the world, but it would impact the opportunities for other major geopolitical players to perhaps take a chance at wreaking havoc this year. From what you're hearing and from your own general sense, how concerned are you about some major event happening this year?
I don't know if it's this year. I suppose the China-Taiwan thing bothers me. Obviously, the recent earthquake in Taiwan is unfortunate, and maybe that creates some kind of opening. But I don't know if that happens this year. Listen, I think bad stuff happens eventually. And I think there's a relative peace and prosperity in the world these days, but you're still going to see a lot of bad stuff crop up. In the Middle East, you continue to see some problems driven by larger powers. I think that the less power a country like the U.S. has, the better off you are. Again, I just think that, the idea that like Malaysia is going to get dragged into something with China, or that Singapore is going to be invaded, I push back on that. I think that's things that people who live in the United States and other countries do to justify staying where they're at and not doing anything about it. I don't really see some of that more far-fetched stuff, but sure, China, Taiwan, that could be an issue. There was talk of Russia, Moldova. It seems like there's been no movement on that, but there's always going to be bad stuff happening. To me, it's levers. How do you adjust?
Right. And again, with you, I understand that the idea is to have options, right? To have the ability to move, to relocate. But, it's interesting because in another one of your videos, you discussed how one should survive the age of disorder. And you said in that video that it feels like we're in the age of disorder more so now than ever before. But you also point out that countries that seem to have order are really not that orderly if you start to look at how institutions and faith in those institutions is crumbling in the West.
Well, people have entrusted Congress in the U.S. for as long as I've been alive. I think only the institutions. Look at what people think about the FBI and the intelligence community and the disease community. And I'm not maybe on the far fringe of that, but I think they have some valid reasons to feel like, hey, some stuff has been withheld. I think people are finally realizing the government does not represent you in Western countries. And then the big countries, there's certainly some, Andorra or something, or even in Ireland, I think people maybe do a little bit more for the citizens. It's a little bit less bureaucratic. It's a little bit less, Machiavellian. But yeah, I think those countries in the West are also very corrupt. It's going to cost $2 billion to elect a president. You tell me there's no corruption in there? It's high level corruption. The average person does not get to partake in that corruption. But that's why Washington's the wealthiest place in the world. And so the idea that they represent you, really? That's not true. I don't think anyone believes it anymore. I think people realize that's kind of an elite class that is, gorging off of their hard work. And that doesn't sound like the American dream. So I think that a lot of faith in institutions is eroding. And I think it's happening in other Western countries as well, partially because the government sat back and did nothing to innovate, did nothing to be competitive. Again, on Ireland did, for example, they used their status in the EU to bring a lot of companies in and create jobs. It's got some of the highest incomes, if not the highest incomes in the world right now. So they did something good for people. But again, why are people so angry? They can't get ahead in the US. Wages haven't gone up that much. Costs have gone up a lot over the years. Can't afford a house. That's the case in a lot of other countries. But for the first time, competition has come to countries like the US, and the people don't like it, and the government didn't do anything about it. But the government's pretty good at is deflecting the blame onto entrepreneurs like us. And that's where people are going now.
Well, it's very tragic that the American dream is fading as we speak, especially for someone such as myself, a legal immigrant who came here to pursue the American dream. And I know that you've said that the idea is to find the next best country to go to before everybody is going to that country. Now, I'm not so sure I'm ready to do that, not even close. But from what you're seeing, what is the next American dream, if you're able to put it in that way?
I think it's a multipolarity. So look, 40 or so years ago at Singapore, maybe that was one of a few places. South Korea was in the fold at that point coming up. Everyone's competing now. And I think it's niche, right? So if you're in AI, there's going to be certain places to go. If you're in the tech space or you're the IT space, there's a lot of countries. Even Armenia, for example, has big, benefits. And you're seeing a lot of Indian companies actually outsource to Armenia for affordable labor and tax breaks. So there's going to be niche players. If you're just a regular entrepreneur, Armenia, we're happy to have you, but they're not going to really roll out the red carpet for you. So, for some people, I think Mexico has been a good place, similar culture, warmer, people. The Americas generally are very immigrant friendly. You can become a citizen. You can speak the language, you can become a citizen. That's interesting. I think Southeast Asia is more laissez-faire. I would call it soft freedom, not hard freedom. It's not enshrined in a constitution necessarily to the same extent, but they just leave you alone. So that's the way it is in a number of places. I would say Eastern Europe as well. Certainly parts of Africa, I would say it's the case. So there's a lot of places to go. I think you see places like the Uruguays of the world that are really pushing to become kind of a Switzerland kind of place. But for investment, I'm looking at emerging markets and frontier markets. I'm looking for yield from, developed markets in Asia. For a place to live, I'm going to be diversified between South America, Southeast Asia, and, a place like Ireland, for example.
So you're suggesting investing in emerging markets right now?
I'm not entirely invested in emerging markets. I have gold, I have crypto, I have developed market, equities and things like that. But yeah, I think if you get on the ground, or if you get close to the ground, through banks in Singapore, Malaysia, et cetera, I can get certain investments that perform better than a U.S. listed ETF in, let's say, Indonesia or India. Those have been two pretty good performing markets for me because they're buying more stocks than just kind of the typical index fund there. There's more stock picking going on. They've outperformed the U.S. ETFs. So markets like that I like. I'm a big fan of direct investment in places like Cambodia. I have been for many years. I think places like Nepal and Bangladesh are coming up. I think Colombia is interesting, has its challenges, but it's interesting. I think Mexico will be very interesting. I think perhaps the time in countries like Georgia has passed. You would have made a lot of money if you would have been there 5 years ago, at my suggestion. So not a lot in Europe. And I think India really, great equity markets. As well as, for just boring yield performance, I'm a believer in Singapore.
But you're talking in terms of more active, involved investing as opposed to buying, the S&P 500 versus an emerging market ETF, because you could see that the S&P 500 has outperformed. I mean, many argue that, that's where the best returns have been lately. Like it or not, the S&P 500 hitting multiple new record highs this year. So again, not asking you for investment advice per se, but what are your thoughts there?
I'm in stocks in the S&P 500, and I've advised my entire team. They say, "What should we do to invest our money?" I said, "Put your first $60,000 into an S&P 500 index fund. After that, you're not American. You'll have estate tax issues." So, for me, I think if you get into individual, not even active investing, but you go to someone who deals in putting together portfolios in a place like Indonesia. You can have them create, better performing funds for you, and just kind of let it ride. And that has outperformed. I mean, look at the Nigerian stock market. I think in January this year, it went to the roof, like 40% or something. And then I looked at what was happening in the U.S. markets, and it was a totally different picture. I know people who are on the ground in Africa; they're making huge returns. Look at every Africa fund in the U.S. I don't know any of them that are doing very well, or that they're all in terrible shape. So, just going and buying a few key stocks is different than having people who are on the ground and doing it. Listen, I have a business that's a growth investment. That's my growth stock. I don't need to buy NVIDIA. I put money into my business, and in the long run, it outperforms that for me, and I get to be in control. But the money that I'm not in control of, I took a 50-year horizon. I think you're going to see managed, stocks in some of these markets do better. I mean, which country is going to grow faster the next 50 years? India or the United States? You'll have some U.S. companies selling to places in India, but you look at so many stumbles in some of these markets. I mean, India is essentially close to a dozen countries if you break it down. Look at Disney most recently. I mean, they fumbled with investments there. I don't know that U.S. companies are the best ones to play into large emerging markets in the future. And I think if you have people on the ground, you'll hear at our event, for example, a guy who's doing business in Cambodia. Some of the real estate returns there are incredible because you're seeing zero skyscrapers going to a lot of skyscrapers. I like that play.
So what do you recommend to people who don't have millions of dollars to allow themselves a passport portfolio or to invest in citizenship around the world, but still want to explore this idea of nomad capitalism? What can they get out of your events? What can they get out of listening to you? What is the alternative for those that hear the sentiment, agree with your philosophy, but are not necessarily at the financial position that they'd like to be to allow themselves this global citizenship and the flexibility that allows?
Well, the first thing is, if you're paying a high rate of tax, which you could pay just by making $100,000 or $200,000, and maybe you don't save a lot of it, but you have a decent income, the best thing you can do is find a way to move that business, move that remote job, move whatever it is to a place where you legally pay less. Even if you're an American, you can make, when you add it all up, close to $140,000 tax-free. If you work with your spouse in a business, potentially they can take the same thing. So that's a way to save a lot of money. We looked at hiring someone from the U.S. We don't have any Americans, but we said, listen, you have to move. I don't want to deal with all the regulations and the consequences of hiring someone who's in the U.S., but you're welcome to move. And listen, as a perk, you're going to save on that first, $100 and some thousand. You're going to save coming from California a hell of a lot of money. And so that's more money to put back into your investments, which if you're young, especially over time, will grow to be a lot. What I would suggest right now is get a residence permit in a Central or South American country. Most of those don't require wealth or deposits. They require proof of income. So even if you have a decent job, you can get in there. Some of them are like $1,000 a month or even less. Get one or two of those. Those will lead to citizenship. So if you ever wanted to live in a country like Mexico in the future, you could start the clock ticking and then go and eventually put your time in for citizenship with the residence permit time counting. I would look at bank accounts. If you don't have a couple $100,000 for Singapore, I would look at a country like Georgia. You can walk in, you can open an account. We have our lawyer who helps people open accounts remotely there coming to the event, and she can help you. But there's like basically no minimum deposit in those banks. There's two that are on the London Stock Exchange. So those are larger banks. That's what I would do. And I would look at maybe have some kind of brokerage account where I could at least have exposure to actual international stocks, not just something that they want to, offer me where it's just a basket of whatever they're selling, but I can go and buy international stocks in other countries. And lastly, if I have a family tree with someone from overseas, I would check that and see if I'm entitled to what's called citizenship by descent. We help people with that as an a la carte service. And it could be your parents, could be your grandparents in some cases, it could be your great grandparents in some cases, or even further in a couple of countries. So if you had a grandfather from Italy, you may be entitled to Italian citizenship and therefore citizenship that allows you to live anywhere in Europe. So those are the things I would do if I'm just starting out.
All right. So final thoughts as we wrap up here. Very excited for the event in September. As we mentioned, a lot of very interesting people attending from around the globe. What are you most excited about for the event, Andrew?
Well, I love bringing people together from all over the world. The event's in Kuala Lumpur because we get a very diverse group of people. We get very high-level North Americans who come. It's a little bit longer of a trip. I happen to think once you're on the plane, you're just on the plane, and it's a nice place to come and see. Go down to Singapore afterwards, check out the banks, check out the gold depositories. But we got people from Malaysia. We got people from Singapore. We got expats who live in Asia. We got people from all over the world. And so you don't get that in an event in West Palm Beach or in Austin, Texas, where people are just talking doom and gloom. You get to meet not only our team from Georgia, from Venezuela, from Serbia, from Montenegro, from Malaysia, from Ireland, from Bulgaria, other countries. You get to meet guests from all over the world. People love that. Nigel Farage 2 years ago was going out saying hello to everybody. You get to talk to luminaries like that. Great food. You get to experience a place that is, in my opinion, the best value city on planet Earth. I'm not saying it's the absolute best place in the world, but I live there. I mean, talk about saving money. Amazing service, amazingly nice people, amazing consumer convenience in Kuala Lumpur. It's half the price or less of what we would have paid in Mexico for our guest hotel room. So I'm excited to be able to see that because I've been there for almost 11 years now. And I want people to know how great Kuala Lumpur is. But I love putting on the event. We have great speakers. It's 4 days. No one can pay to speak on the stage. No one can pay to sponsor us. It's just everyone that I've curated that I think a nomad capitalist should learn from. And I don't agree with every single thing that every single person is going to say, but you should know the perspective of how they've made their money overseas, or how our team has run, companies all around the world, or how our team hires people all around the world, following what we call the culture map. You'll learn about that. We actually do this stuff. And I love sharing with people, here's how it actually works to a higher level than we talk about on YouTube, because it's intimate. And we can talk about here's what actually works. Here's what doesn't. We can squash people's misconceptions. And people leave with their minds exploding, quite frankly, because we have some very, very packed days.
Well, I'm looking forward to having my mind explode. There is one point of concern, though, Andrew, that people have raised when they hear Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur. Yeah. So you say when you want to dispel misconceptions, how do you address the idea of, well, religious tolerance is not exactly very high in Malaysia, not exactly the most welcoming to people in the LGBTQ community, where certain rights that people have gotten used to in the West perhaps are not upheld so much in a place like Malaysia. Should that be a concern for people attending? What do you say to that?
Well, if you're looking to come and have a protest, I mean, there is some freedom of speech. I see people protesting, but I don't think it's necessarily a protest culture. And they probably don't want to see a protest for some of the things you'd protest in the West. I don't think you should do that. But what I've been told for many years, and my mother came to visit me many years ago. We went to a Christian church. We went to a Christian bookstore. She's an evangelical Christian. She talked to a lot of people. They're there. You've got Chinese Christians. You've got expat Christians. You've got, obviously, in Malaysia, not only the Muslims, the Malays, but you've got Malaysian Chinese. You've got Malaysian Indians. You've got people from all over the world who are there. Some of them are Muslim. Many of them are not. But what the Muslim population would tell you is we have our God that we follow, and you have your God, or maybe you don't. But we're going to judge our own people. We're not going to judge you. It's a very liberal place. People dress how they want. They eat what they want. They drink what they want. The Muslim sales clerk is not going to sell you the pork. There's going to be a separate counter if you want to buy pork at the grocery store. You can't do drugs in Malaysia. That's a pretty bad idea to come and do that. They're very against that. But quite frankly, I think it's one of the most open, tolerant places, not because someone tells them they have to be. I think that's just a culture. There's a laid-back approach to life. There's a laissez-faire approach to, just kind of everyday management, especially for foreigners. And, to me, you can't beat that. It's like in my company. Half of our positions, we've got to train people from scratch. And so I'm not looking necessarily for the best skills. I'm looking for aptitude. I'm looking for agreeableness. If you have those things, you can mold the right person if they have the right attitude. And so I would say the same thing about a culture. If the idea is, hey, we've got a constitution, we're going to cling to that. One day the politicians, the people said, hey, you know what? Let's not follow that anymore. And they ripped the thing up. So what is that constitution worth? What you want is the spirit of the people. I think they're some of the nicest people, and they'll tell you to your face. We've had LGBT guests before, and they were concerned. And they came to the exact same conclusion. One of them told me at the end of the event, yeah, I talked to people. Hey, that's you and your God. You're allowed to be different. We're not going to judge you for that.
All right. Well, I am looking forward to the event in September to hear the excellent speakers that you have curated and to get more perspective on how to be a nomad capitalist. Andrew, thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you then. And thank you for joining us today on Kitco.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you. As always, thank you to our viewers for watching. For me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the Kitco team. If you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.